In this lecture, we are going to explore event handling in React. Events play a major role in the browser. In the real world, birthdays, achievements, and marriages are considered events. The idea of events can be applicable to the programming world. However, they're not as exciting. Mouse clicks, scrolling, or typing on the keyboard can be considered an event. The browser provides an API for listening to events with JavaScript. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a function called add-event-listener. If you're not using React, you must use this function for working with events. Luckily, React provides an easier API for handling events. Check out the resource section for another link. React allows us to listen to events on elements with attributes. If you scroll through the page, you may come across a section called Supported Events. React supports most of the events available in the browser. Feel free to search through the list of events after finishing this lecture. Let's leverage this feature in our app. For this example, let's create a link that will count the number of times the link has been clicked. Back in our project, create a file inside the source directory called counter.js. To keep our code clean, a separate component will handle this logic. At the top of the file, import the React object from the React package. Next, define a function called counter. Inside the function, create a variable that will be set to the react.useState function. We're going to call the useState function to keep track of the clicks performed on the link. Initially, the count should be set to 0. Let's pass that in. After setting the initial value, we can destructure the return value by adding a pair of square brackets. Inside these brackets, set the names to count and setCount, respectively. The first variable will hold the current value. The second variable will hold a function for updating the value. Next, we can begin to create the link. After the variable definition, return an anchor element. The href attribute should be set to a hash character. The inner text should say the following: count, count. Inside the element, we are rendering the current count with a placeholder. Let's test our code by adding this component to our application. First, we must export the component. Add the export default keywords to the function definition. Next, open the page file. At the top of the file, we can import the component with the name counter from the counter file. The name can be anything. It doesn't have to be counter. Functions or variables exported under the default namespace won't be assigned a name. This gives our import statements the power to use a different name. However, for consistency, let's keep using the same name. Under the paragraph element, let's add the counter component. We've successfully created a component for counter clicks on a link. If we look at the page, the link should appear at the bottom. Unfortunately, there are some problems with the link. Firstly, if we click on the link, nothing happens. The counter should be updated after it has been clicked. Secondly, the URL has been changed. A hash character will appear at the end of the URL. The anchor element is an example of an element with default behavior attached to it. Once clicked, it'll manipulate the current URL to the value from the href attribute. We should avoid this behavior. Let's fix both issues. Head back to the counter component. The goal is to handle click events on the link. This process is known as listening to an event. On the anchor element, we can listen for clicks by adding an attribute called onClick. The spelling is crucial. The word click must be capitalized. By adding this attribute, React will allow us to run a function on a click event. You can refer to the documentation for a complete list of valid events. The onClick event is the preferred event for handling clicks. The value for this attribute must be an expression. As we've learned, a JavaScript expression can be added to an attribute by adding a pair of curly brackets. Inside these brackets, let's set the function name to handleClick. This function doesn't exist. Before defining it, let's take a closer look at the value. We are not adding the parentheses. By adding parentheses, the function will be called immediately. It doesn't matter if a visitor clicks on the link. That's not what we want. The behavior should be to call this function on clicks. By removing the parentheses, React will not call the function. Instead, it'll wait to call the function. Adding or removing parentheses can make a huge difference. Let's move on to defining the function. The function can be defined from within the counter component. I'm going to define it above the return statement. This syntax is completely valid. We're allowed to create nested functions. The benefit of nesting our functions is isolating them from other areas of our application. It's going to be nearly impossible to run this function from the outside. There isn't a point in sharing this function with other files. It's perfectly acceptable to define functions from within a function. Let's address the issues with our solution. First, we're going to add an argument called event. React events are an extension of JavaScript events. The syntax is easier to read and write with React. However, React doesn't keep you out of the loop. JavaScript events will pass on an object called event. React will pass this object onto us. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this object. To be clear, this object is coming from JavaScript. It's not related to React. This documentation page will provide a comprehensive list of the properties and methods of the event object. This object contains information on the current event. Most importantly, it has a method for preventing the default behavior of an element. As we discussed before, links will manipulate the current URL with the value from the href attribute. This behavior can be prevented by running a method called preventDefault. Let's give it a try. Back in our function, let's run the event.preventDefault function. That'll fix the issue with the link. In some cases, developers will refer to the argument as E, which is short for event. For this example, we're going to use the full name for clarity. However, you're more than welcome to change the argument to E. Let's move on to updating the count. After preventing the default behavior, call the setCount function. There are two types of values we can pass onto the setCount function. The first option would be to pass in a value. The second option would be to pass in a function. If we pass in a function, React will run the function. The value returned by our function will be the new value of the state variable. Let's pass in a function. You may be wondering, why are we using a function? The reason is simple. The new value should be the previous value incremented by 1. The function passed into the setCount function will be provided an argument called previous_value. Without passing in a function, we don't have access to the previous value. Let's return the following: previous_value plus 1. In my opinion, an arrow function might be more suitable for readability purposes. In this example, it doesn't matter if the function is a regular or an arrow function. However, readability is important. I think an arrow function is easier to read and write. Therefore, I'm going to convert this example into an arrow function. Arrow functions can omit the return keyword if the arrow function is written as one line. JavaScript will assume the value must be returned. This example is the same example as before. Feel free to use either one. Let's try testing our app. If you click on the link, the count will get updated. Perfect. This was the exact behavior we were looking for. Overall, working with events is easy. You simply attach the event name as an attribute to the element. Next, you can run a function to handle the event. Let's explore one more feature of React before moving on to other topics.